Hey everybody, it's 5 o'clock. You know what that means. Time for another AP World History review session. I know 5 o'clock usually means quitting time for people at work, but we are just getting started. All right, my name is Mason Logereau. I'm coming to you live from the Austin, Texas area, specifically Pflugerville, Texas. And today we're going to look at what I put here as maritime empires, but really what we're talking about is European empires that are expanding into the Americas and around the Indian Ocean in the 15 and 1600s. We're also going to talk a little contextualization today, although honestly, I've been talking a lot about contextualization of entire essays, like you put in your introduction. We've talked about that a couple times already. Today, I want to think about more context of individual documents in a DBQ. So thinking about the historical situation of a primary source. All right, so just to kind of recap, if you hopefully watched the videos from Monday and Tuesday, if you haven't, you definitely need to go back and watch those. Not right now, don't stop me now, let's watch this one. But go back and watch, because on Monday, I covered all of the technological and political developments that we see in Europe that lead to European exploration. Yesterday, Mr. Smith from Dallas did a great job of covering the Columbian Exchange, once, of course, Europeans arrived in the Americas. Although he did actually leave out one very important fact about the Columbian Exchange. So I'm gonna let you know about this one now. And Smith, what happened? You left out the most important thing. And that is that the term Columbian Exchange was actually coined by a very famous historian, Alfred Crosby. He's kind of a bigwig in the world history circles. But here's the fact about Dr. Crosby. He was actually a professor at the University of Texas, my alma mater. So obviously that's the most important thing you need to know about the Columbian Exchange. Anyway, hook 'em. We're a great university. We have really fantastic professors, and we're great at football sometimes, or at least we used to be, but oh well. Okay, anyway, let's get into it. All right, before we start, Smith gave y'all some homework last night. And actually, it was kind of built on the homework that I gave y'all on Monday. So remember on Monday, I gave y'all a DBQ. And by the way, if you haven't looked at it or if you've forgotten the documents, you might want to pause right now and download that again. It's in the Google Drive folder that we created for these videos, which is, the link is right below me. Click see more, and then you'll see it. And it's under the review folder. It's labeled as 4.1, 4.2 homework, because that's when we started all of this. But it is a 5-document DBQ about the Portuguese and the Indian Ocean. And if you remember, on Monday night, I had y'all write an introductory paragraph, so contextualization and thesis statement. And then last night, Smith had y'all take the documents and write out paragraphs that would support the claims that we made in the thesis statement. So I want to go through a couple paragraphs that he wrote for y'all and kind of give you examples of what went well in them. Okay, so the first claim that I wrote in the thesis statement was that the Portuguese were taxing non-Portuguese ships. And you can see that pretty clearly in document 4. So notice here, Smith wrote out a paragraph about document 4 explaining how it shows that the Portuguese were taxing non-Portuguese ships. Okay. Notice a couple things here. He gets straight to the point. He explains why the document supports the claim. He doesn't quote the document, which, by the way, you know, some teachers are like very anti-quote in the documents. I've heard some teachers say, no, never quote. My feeling is you're welcome to quote if you want. There's nothing against it. I don't know that it adds a lot of value, but sometimes it can if you quote like a phrase or maybe even a half sentence at most. But please don't quote like big long sentences from these documents, because then it just looks like you're trying to fill up space in your paper, which sometimes you might be if you don't know what you're writing about. But anyway, he doesn't quote. He just simply puts the document into his own words and then explains how it supports the claim. The other nice thing he does, and this is kind of a small thing, but it is important, notice he puts the author of the document, which of course that's a good idea, but he also puts the document number in parentheses. Please make sure you put the document number in parentheses in your DBQ. You can refer to the author, you can refer to the title of the document, those things are great, but at some point in there, mention the document number. It makes life so much easier for the reader, and you want the reader in a happy frame of mind when they read your DBQ. putting the document numbers makes them happy. Just a quick word of advice from someone who's read a bunch of essays in his day. Okay, the next one was about how the Portuguese never really extended their control except for a few ports on the coast of Africa and some in South Asia. Okay, here he uses document 1, but Smith wrote a note here that is important to read in red, that document 1 does not fully support that claim. It goes part of the way, but it doesn't quite finish the job. This would be a great time to add some outside evidence. Because listen, the Portuguese and the Indian Ocean, that's something that you studied. That's something that you know about. You should be able to add in some outside information to finish making this claim. Now, we're not doing that today because, you were just using the documents, but Smith is going to talk to you all about that tomorrow. And then the final one here, you have documents 2 and 3 being used to show that the Portuguese are still having to compete with Indian merchants and other kingdoms and governments. Okay. Now, I know that teachers have been telling y'all all year long, you got to group the documents together. I've been telling my students the same thing. You start putting together a couple of documents and you try and use 2 or 3 documents if you can to support your claim, kind of like Smith is doing right here. But guys, I'm going to be honest with y'all. With this year's DBQ, being that's only 45 minutes and you only have 5 documents, grouping those documents is going to be tough. Okay, it just is. So if you can, great, by all means, it'd be really good. Try and use 2 or 3 documents, put them together to support one claim. But you know how there's always that one really hard document that doesn't really seem to fit with the other ones? It's fine if you use a document by itself to make a claim, just like Smith did in that first paragraph. There's really nothing wrong with that. Especially this year, I'd rather you have another paragraph with one document supporting one claim than trying to like shoehorn it and fit it into a place where it really doesn't belong. As long as you're using the document to make a claim that answers the prompt, then you're going to get credit for it. Okay. So grouping documents is great. You should try and do it. But if you can't, especially for that one weird document, that's okay. Just write it in its own paragraph and you'll be fine. But ideally, you would like to see something like this with 2 or 3 documents. But just remember that the readers who grade the AP test, they know that you're under a time crunch. They know you only have 45 minutes. They know that you've been, outside the school building now for a month. So they understand if you're going to have trouble with it in that 45 minutes. We're not expecting a perfect polished essay. Everyone realizes that. Okay, now consider here, so far for this DBQ, over the last 2 nights, you've written your introduction that had thesis and contextualization. That's 2 points. And if you wrote out these paragraphs last night, you used 4 out of the 5 documents to support a claim. That's worth 3 points in this new rubric. So you're already up to a 5 out of 10. And I know that 5 out of 10 doesn't sound that good because, think about it, it's 50%. If you got that on a grade for something in your class, you would probably be upset with getting a 50. But actually, remember on the AP test, getting a 5 out of 10 on this essay is doing decently well. Now, I have no idea what the scores are going to look like this year. This is such a crazy year. So I don't know what to tell you. But I will tell you, last year on the 7-point rubric, the average on the DBQ was a 2.3. It's going to be a little bit higher this year because the points are a little bit easier to get, and there's 10 of them, obviously. But understand, if you can get 5, 6 points, I think you're going to be in a good spot. Now, I don't know what that's going to translate to for your AP test score. I've seen people trying to discuss it, trying to figure it out. I'm going to tell y'all, ignore what those people say because they do not know what they're talking about. No one knows right now what that means. Hey, I got a 6 out of 10 on the DBQ. What's that going to be for my AP test score? We don't know. That is not going to be figured out until after the AP tests are graded in June. So you're not going to know that when you walk into the test. So what I'm going to tell y'all, my biggest thing is just get as many points as you can. There's 5 points that we've already gone over right these last couple of days that are, I'm not saying they're easy to get, but they're within your grasp. Grab a couple more points from the outside evidence or from sourcing, and you can get up to 6, 7, 8 points and do pretty well. Okay. But just make sure you get as many points as you can in those 45 minutes. All right, so let's get into our action today, talking about these European empires that are expanding in the 15 and 1600s. Okay, I've given you kind of a list of the major European players that you do need to know and the areas of the world they spread into. Notice for each of them, most of them were in the Americas and then somewhere around the Indian Ocean basin. You do need to know these major players. You do need to know kind of generally where they settled their colonies and where they took over. But beyond that, you don't need to know like every single detail about all 5 of these countries and their new empires. In fact, what I would suggest is spend some time doing a deep dive of one of them. You pick one, whichever one you're interested in, do a deep dive of that and know one of them really, really well, because that could possibly be outside evidence for the DBQ. If the DBQ has something to do with this topic, and you can bring in details about the French and the Caribbean or up in modern day Canada, well, that's going to be really helpful. That's going to get you a few extra points on the DBQ. So don't feel like you have to know every single thing about all 5 of these. Instead, know a little bit about each one, generally where they are, and then do a deep dive on whichever one you're interested in. And that'll be plenty. Also today, as we're talking about this expansion of European empires, I'm not going to talk too much about its effects on Europe. Instead, we're going to look at the impact that it has on other parts of the world, mainly the area of Asia around the Indian Ocean, West Africa, and the Americas are where we're going to look. And the reason for that is because there is this temptation when teaching world history to kind of fall into the trap of being too Eurocentric. And I don't know if your teacher has talked to you about this before or mentioned in class, but I think it is important for you to understand, because we're getting to that point in history where Europe is starting to become a major political, military, and economic power. And we're going to see it here. We're going to see it after the Industrial Revolution, and it continues on until the 20th century. And I'll just tell you from personal experience, for a lot of teachers, when we were in school, world history was extremely Eurocentric. Okay, I took world history when I was in high school back in the day. But back then, world history meant we studied what happened in Europe and we studied the United States, and that was it. We barely ever touched anything in Asia or Africa or South America. It was Europe, it was the United States, it was a Western Civ class. But fortunately, over the last several years, there has been this push by historians to say, look, if you're teaching world history, then you should, teach everything in the world and not just in one continent. So today I want to take a special look at other parts of the world that are being impacted by this expansion of European empires. All right, so let's start with Asia, and more specifically, the area around the Indian Ocean. So that incorporates South Asia, Southeast Asia, also East Africa as well, because that coastline had a lot of ports. They're very important for Indian Ocean trade. Okay, we know that Indian Ocean trade has been a thing for several centuries before this. We have talked about it already before in these videos. You talked about it in class. The Portuguese arrive. After that, other European merchants begin arriving, and European merchants become the ones that in many cases are shipping goods to all these different regions of Africa and Asia. They're taking goods from, let's say, South Asia, from India, and bringing them to Southeast Asia or into China. They're also the ones that are bringing in silver. Okay, let's talk about silver here for a second, because it's an extremely important part of this long distance trade that you need to understand. Silver ends up becoming essentially kind of a worldwide currency that can be used almost anywhere to buy and sell goods. Now remember, gold has always kind of been a type of worldwide currency. Gold is valuable almost everywhere. But the problem is that gold is so rare that it's just not practical to be a real currency. And yes, I know the reason why gold is so expensive is because it is rare. But again, it's just not practical because there's not that much gold to go around the world. But once silver is discovered in the Americas, And once the Spanish and Portuguese begin building mines in South America to get the silver out of the ground, they start using it in commerce around the world. And the thing about silver is it's still fairly valuable, but there's enough of it to where it can be a practical currency. So now the Portuguese and the Spanish, as they arrive in Asia, have something that everybody else wants. And it ends up becoming a currency all around the Indian Ocean. Now, you know that this is also the time that leaders of the Ming Dynasty in China began requiring that Chinese citizens pay their taxes in silver coin. Previously, Chinese citizens could have paid their taxes in almost any type of currency or in crops or in animals or anything like that. But now they're being required to pay it in silver. So now there's a huge high demand for silver in East Asia. So make sure you understand the importance of silver in all the Indian Ocean trade as well. We also, though, do start to see China and especially Japan begin closing themselves off to this European influence. Not completely at all, but for example, in Japan, there was only one port where European merchants were allowed to enter and exit and to sell goods. There were Christian missionaries that went to Japan, but after a while that was outlawed. Missionaries were not allowed, Christian missionaries were not allowed in Japan. By the way, if you want a really good book recommendation, the book Silence. It's absolutely fantastic. It's about a couple of Portuguese missionaries that traveled to Japan in the 1600s. And they actually made a movie out of it a couple of years ago. Martin Scorsese directed it, and it had, oh, what's the guy's name? The actor, he plays Kylo Ren. Y'all know who I'm talking about. The Driver, Adam Driver. That's the one. Yeah. All right. Took me a little while. Adam Driver's in it. I never saw the movie, so I can't recommend it. In fact, I heard it's pretty violent, so maybe you shouldn't watch it, but the book is fantastic. But anyway, what was I talking about? Oh, yeah. So we do see some countries trying to stop this European expansion into their countries. We also see empires like the Spanish and the Dutch begin taking over parts of the Spice Islands in Southeast Asia. But then we also see countries like England who are beginning to kind of sort of take over India, but not a complete takeover yet. We know that's coming, right? That the British will eventually take over India. But remember, at this point, the Mughal Empire is still going strong in India. The British just are not going to be able to beat them at all. But you do see the British starting to set up in port cities all along the coast of India. And from there, we're going to see this kind of slow encroachment, slowly moving into India, where eventually they're going to take it over. But make sure you kind of understand the differences in how these empires are expanding and how much control they have over the territory that they're colonizing. Okay, real quickly, this box right here. This is from the DBQ that you've been working on the last couple of nights. This is, I believe, document 5 in it. This is actually from last year's AP test. This was the DBQ in last year's AP test. I took out 2 documents to make it a 5-document one. But I keep talking about that kind of one weird document. Last year, this was the one weird document. This is the one that drove students nuts. I was grading these last year for the AP test, and there were so many students that either skipped this document or messed up when they were talking about it. And even my own students later on were complaining, like, why is there a box? Why is there a picture of a box? What does that have to do with anything? In fact, if you have any friends that took AP World last year, ask them about the DBQ and ask them about the box, and I'm sure they're going to go on a long rant about it. But even though this box looks kind of weird, and like, what does this have to do with the Portuguese or any of that? You can still use it in a DBQ. I mean, look at the description. We know that it's extremely expensive. It's got ebony, it's got ivory, it's got a lot of really expensive things in it. We also know from the tagline here that it was meant to be exported to Portugal. So that tells us a couple of things here. One, it shows us how involved the Portuguese now are in Indian Ocean trade. It also shows us that there's a really large desire or market for expensive goods from Asia in Europe. Wealthy Europeans are wanting to purchase really exotic imports from Asia. So even though it's just a picture of a box, there are things that we find out about it and we can use it in our DBQ. So remember, that's what I've been saying. There's going to be that one weird document. Figure out a way to use it anyway. And hey, if you write something and it's wrong, that's okay, because you're going to use the other 4 documents correctly and still get the points. So you'll be okay. All right, let's talk about a historical situation real quick, because remember, that is one way that you can source a document on the test. Remember, for this year's rubric, you're going to have to source 2 documents, and you can get 2 points if you do it. But it's not just a matter of identifying the point of view, purpose, audience, or historical situation. You also need to kind of explain the so what of it. Why is it important? So we're going to practice that today a couple of times. Here, I've given you a prompt at the top, social and economic effects of the global flow of silver. And what I'd like for you to do is to pause the video, read the document, and then you don't need to worry about making a claim or any of that right now. We're not doing thesis statements, but let's think about sourcing. If you were going to write this DBQ, how would you source this document? All right, so pause the video, take a couple minutes. When you're ready, unpause, and I'll go over the answers with you. Ready? Go. All right, welcome back. If we're going to talk about historical situation, notice this is being written in China. He's talking about the fact that dye shops in China are now expecting customers to pay in silver, because the dye shop itself also needs silver to be able to pay its taxes to the Ming officials. So if I'm talking about historical situation, I'm definitely going to bring in the fact that the Ming officials are expecting taxes to be paid in silver. That means that everyone needs that hard currency. They need silver coins. And so now you see less of a bartering type of economy, where even if you went to the store, you used to be able to pay with, well, you can see there, rice, wheat, soybeans, chickens, whatever. But now customers are being expected to pay in hard currency and silver coin. So that's definitely a social effect of the global flow of silver. So notice I identified the historical situation, and then I explained why that's important. I gave the so what of it, and I connected it back to the topic of the prompt. So that's what you need to do for, again, at least 2 documents. But as I said the other day, you might want to try it for 3, because sourcing, it can be tough to do. And if you try it for 3 and you mess up on 1, that's okay, because you've still done 2 correctly. You can still get those 2 points. All right, let's move on and talk about Africa and the impact that European expansion had on Africa. Now, yesterday, Smith did a really great job of talking about the slave trade from Africa to the Americas. So we're not going to rehash that. But if you want more details on it, definitely go watch Smith's video from yesterday. But remember that even pre-European arrival, there had been a slave trade, especially in North Africa, where we usually saw people being kidnapped and enslaved and sent to places like the Middle East. But it was kind of a small trade. When Europeans arrive, the whole thing just explodes in numbers. And we see a massive forced migration of humans from Africa to the Americas. And there were some that went to Europe, and there were still some that went to the Middle East, but the vast, vast majority went to the Americas. Okay, like I said, Smith talked about that yesterday, so we're not going to go into detail on it, but let's think about the impact that that has on the people that remained in Africa. First off, you actually do see the rise of some larger kingdoms in Africa, like the Ashanti and the Kingdom of the Congo. You should be familiar with those for a couple of reasons. One, there's a massive, trade network going through North Africa, connecting them now to the Americas and still to the Indian Ocean. And it's not just slaves, it's also foodstuffs as well from Africa. And we still have the gold and salt trade from West Africa across the Sahara Desert. So there is some money flowing into these kingdoms from all of this long distance trade. Also, we see a population increase in a lot of these centralized governments of Africa, because what you need to remember is that, typically speaking, the people that were kidnapped and enslaved usually came from rural areas. If you were by yourself in a rural area, that was extremely unsafe. Typically, you did not see as many people being enslaved that lived in these powerful kingdoms or in urban areas, the whole like safety in numbers type of thing. So as the slave trade begins to increase, you see a lot of people moving from rural areas into more established governments and into urban areas. So the population of these larger kingdoms is growing. Again, that means more economic and military power for these kingdoms. Also, remember that the majority of people that are enslaved were usually men. Of course, there were women enslaved as well, but the majority were men. So in parts of West Africa, you have now a gender imbalance because, again, most people that were enslaved came from West Africa, or at least a large number of them. So there are some regions where there are a lot more women than men. And so for the women that are staying behind in Africa, they're having to take on traditional male roles in those economies. So it's affecting social life and gender relations as well in Africa. And then we also really need to consider the impact that it has on the economy and the demographics of Africa. Now, a lot of times students think that the population of Africa declined this time because so many people were being forced in migration to the Americas. It's not that the population of Africa declined. In fact, the population of Africa over these couple centuries did increase. But the problem is that the population in other parts of the world is also increasing much faster. The population of Europe is exploding. So relatively speaking, the population of Africa is increasing at a much slower rate than other parts of the world, especially Europe and the Americas. So that's going to have an economic impact if you don't have as many people. Also consider that most of the people that were enslaved were usually pretty young. So if you have someone who's, say, 20, 25 years old, who's now being forced to go to the Americas, well, that's someone who is going to be working for the next several decades. So now the place that they came from is missing out on a bunch of economic production over the next several decades, and it's been taken from them. And then you got to consider with population, these are young men and women that are being enslaved, young men and women who would have stayed and had kids. So you're missing out on the possible kids that were born, and the kids of those kids, and the kids of those kids, on through the generations. So it has a huge negative economic and demographic impact on Africa, especially in West Africa. All right, let's take a second and do another sourcing. I've got a different prompt here for you, so take a look, make sure you read it. Here we're talking about African slaves and their descendants and how they were seeking freedom in the Atlantic world. And we have a Spanish governor in Costa Rica, because this, of course, was part of the Spanish Empire of the Americas. So again, I want you to take some time. You're going to pause the video. You're going to read the document. And then, again, think about sourcing. All right? Especially think about historical situation and what's going on here. All right, so go ahead and pause now. All right, welcome back. Possible answers that you could have mentioned here if we're talking about historical situation. You could have talked about the encomienda and hacienda systems of labor in Spanish America. You could have also talked about the racial structure of Spanish America. And Smith is going to go into this a little bit tomorrow, so I don't want to go too far into it. But remember that in Spanish America, there was a very rigid class structure, or racial structure, I should say, set up, depending on what race you were, whether you're Spanish, whether you're African, whether you're Native American, or some kind of mixture of different ones. And very rigid system based on all of that. And you can see it mentioned here in the very first sentence. when talking about all the different groups and different races. You could also see examples of the encomienda and hacienda systems in line 3 when talking about living in Christian discipline. Because remember, Spanish overseers were put in charge of making sure that Native Americans in their area were working, but they were also expected to make sure those Native Americans were becoming Christian and practicing Christianity. So again, you can use some of that historical situation and bring it to bear on the document and explain that, and then it helps better illuminate the document and helps better understand the prompt. All right, as far as the Americas go, if we're talking about regions of the world that were impacted by European expansion, I would say, of course, the Americas probably had the largest impact, no doubt about it. Yesterday, Smith talked about diseases that Europeans brought to the Americas, especially smallpox and others. So again, we're not going to go through too much of that, but make sure that you go back and watch that video. But that, of course, leads to a massive, massive population decline. I mean, estimates vary, of course, but it could have been upwards of 90% of the population of the Americas in this time died from diseases that Europeans brought over. That's insane when you think about it. There was a great book I read a couple years ago, and I was trying to remember the name of it and the author today, and I could not remember it. But he was talking about this idea that for so long, the story was told of Europeans like Columbus discovered America, and they tamed the wilderness, and they brought civilization. Okay, no, that's a bunch of baloney. And this author pointed out, he said, Europeans didn't tame the wilderness of the Americas, they created the wilderness. When 90% of the population dies off, then yeah, it's going to look like a wilderness. But we know that there were large civilizations and empires, like the Aztecs and Incas, that were almost wiped out because of Europeans, Spanish and Portuguese coming into South America and Central America. You know, and here the Spanish are thinking that they can conquer, and they conquered it pretty easily. Well, yeah, because 90% of the population died off from disease before fighting even started. And the Spanish had guns, and if you have guns and you have diseases, it's going to be a pretty quick takeover. Make sure you know about the different labor systems that we see in the Americas. We've already talked about slavery, or at least Smith did yesterday. Make sure you know about indentured servants also. People that came to the Americas and were willing to work for passage to the Americas, but in a lot of cases, they're working in some of the same conditions as slaves and turns into almost slave-like conditions. It's definitely a form of coerced labor. And then, as we mentioned already, you need to know about the encomienda and hacienda systems as well, that the Spanish organize in order to organize labor of the Native Americans. But also consider the natural resources that were taken from the Americas. We already mentioned silver. The Spanish and Portuguese discover silver underground in South America. They start building mines, they pump the silver out, and then they start sending it across the world. So the Spanish and Portuguese kings are making a ton of money, and merchants are making a ton of money off of this silver. This isn't necessarily, though, benefiting the people of the Americas. So when we talk about the rise of Europe in this time, and I said already, you know, they're going to become economic and military powerhouse. These countries are. Well, yeah, they are, because they're enslaving people from some parts of the world. They're stealing natural resources from other parts of the world. When you do that, you're going to make a lot of money. And that's really what we see with the rise of Europe in this time. All right, let's do one more sourcing here. This is, again, a different prompt. We're thinking about the extent to which Christianity changed societies in Latin America. And this is being written by, it says, an emissary from the King of Spain. So think of like an ambassador, someone from Spain who's now traveling to Paraguay and South America and writing down what happened to him. So again, take a second, read the document, pause the video, read the document, and then think about how you might talk about sourcing for this document. Ready, All right. If one possible way you could talk about it, the fact that the author here is from Spain, like I mentioned, and he sees Catholicism as the true religion. And in fact, he mentions it there in the third line where he says there was little true religion among the Indians. Now, that might not technically be historical situation. That's probably more point of view. But either way, you can still be sourcing for a document. You're going to find oftentimes that when you start writing out the sourcing, you might start talking about historical situation, but sometimes that kind of bleeds into point of view or purpose or even sometimes audience. And that's fine. Okay, there's not going to be the reader when they're grading your essay is not going to say something like, oh, well, this student said historical situation. This is obviously an example of purpose, so no way. No, if you're sourcing it, if you're giving correct information, you're bringing it to bear, you're linking it to the topic, then you're going to be fine. Okay, so don't feel like you have to label it historical situation or purpose. Just go into more depth about the document and you'll be good. All right, so what do we talk about today? First off, this expansion of European maritime empires impacts nearly the entire world. Some areas, of course, more than others, but there are very few parts of the world that are untouched by what's happening here. Also, I've talked plenty of context for full essays over the last couple of weeks, but it's still important to use historical situation as well to source those individual documents. You got to do at least 2 on the test to get those 2 points. And again, like I said, you might bleed a little bit into purpose, audience, or point of view, and that is fine. Also, one more thing I want you to think about. I've talked a lot about how to organize your notes for this DBQ because you are allowed to use your notes, but if you're like my students, you've got a bunch of notes from this year, and it's gonna be hard to go through those in 45 minutes because you're really not gonna have a lot of time to sit there and read all your notes. If I were you, think about this topic, and you could do some kind of graphic organizer, maybe do like a compare and contrast of the different regions and how they were impacted by European expansion. Maybe if you've done like a Persia chart, a lot of teachers do those types of things where you look at political, economic, social, cultural characteristics of an event. Something like that might work as well. But you need some way that you're organizing your notes to get ready for this DBQ. One, organizing it and writing it down is going to help you to remember it better. And if you have it in a really easy to read, easy to reach format, you could still use it on this year's DBQ. All right, you got homework tonight. Hey, it's the same DBQ that Smith had you look at last night, and I had you look at Monday night. It's almost as if we're writing a full essay this week. Huh, interesting. Oh, by the way, I completely forgot to mention, good news. Speaking of writing full essays, you're going to have a chance to write 2 of them in a couple of weeks. Yay, writing 2 full essays. No, it's actually a cool thing. Next week, we're going to be finishing up these review videos as far as like reviewing old history content. But the week after, Smith and I are going to do some practice DBQ writing with you. So we'll still be the same time. We'll still be on YouTube like this. On Monday, I'm going to give you a DBQ and prompt. You're going to spend this time writing it. On Tuesday, I'm going to go over the scoring with you. The Wednesday, Smith is going to come on. He's going to do a DBQ with you. You're going to write it. Thursday, he's going to go over it. And then Friday, get excited because he and I are going to be doing this together and kind of going over last minute study tips, things you need to know about the DBQ and all of that. So we'll cover all this later. We'll remind you about it. But the point is, you are going to have some time to write these 5 document DBQs in the 45-minute time period, the time limit that you have. So we're going to get you some practice, not next week, but the week after. And we'll get you more details as we get closer. But for tonight, getting back to the homework. Again, the Google Drive, there is a PDF. It's labeled 4.1 to 4.2 homework. Pull it up. It's a DBQ. It's got 5 documents. And what I'd like for you to do tonight is to think about the sourcing. So pick 3 of the documents. You don't need to do all 5, but pick 3 and write down how you would approach that in your essay. Think about either point of view, purpose, audience, or historical situation. And then Smith will go over that with you tomorrow. All right. Y'all have a good night. Thank you so much for attending, and I will see y'all on Friday. Bye, everybody.